Revitalize your brand and accelerate your impact with Eddie and Erica at Elevate One Consulting. Experts in organizational development, digital marketing, and much more. From leadership coaching to creating unforgettable digital experiences, we've got you covered. Visit elevateoneconsulting.com today. Elevate One Consulting. Innovate, grow, elevate. Welcome back to The Unbroken Place, where it begins and ends with empathy. I am your host, Eddie Paul Thomas, and this week we are going deep into a topic that doesn't really get discussed all that often, at least not publicly. Imagine for a moment, you've been working for 10 to 15 years at a company, working your way from entry level to supervisor to management, and finally you make it to the top. Or going to postgraduate school for years to earn your master's or doctorate degree. You're now a director, an executive, a member of the C-suite, and all of a sudden, all of the pressure is on you. All of the failures are placed on you. The fate of several employees is placed on you. In many ways, you're asked to and possibly required to lose some of your humanity, and that takes a toll. This week's topic is trauma and grief in the C-suite. My guests are two amazing women who are not only experts in the field, but are helping key decision makers cope with the reality of their professional positions. Sabrina Gilchrist is an author, public speaker, clinical mental health counselor, spiritual teacher, and ordained Christian minister, dedicated to empowering others through her passion, authenticity, and wit. With degrees from Winston-Salem State University and Wake Forest University, she has served the Charlotte community since 2010, currently leading Right Moves for Youth as executive director and working in private practice at Reconciliation Counseling and Consulting. Tawani Dewberry is the CEO of the Girl Scouts Hornets Nest Council, serving over 7,000 members across North and South Carolina, and has over 20 years of executive experience and 14 years of counseling practice. Recognized for her leadership, she was inducted into the Gardner-Webb University Gallery of Distinguished Alumni and named among Charlotte's most influential women and most admired CEOs. While also actively contributing to various community organizations and excelling in personal endeavors, she's also a mother, athlete, and musician. This three-part conversation was in many ways illuminating, funny, and a much-needed conversation that I hope will equip you with some helpful tools. So let's go. I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today on The Unbroken Place. I am just honored to have you both specifically talking about this topic that I think a lot of people wouldn't really consider, and that is trauma and grief in the C-suite. And I know that both of you have experience in counseling and as executive leaders out in the community, but I just wanted to say thank you for joining us, because this is a very important topic.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
So we've already kind of given the audience a background on you and you know, kind of what you do for the community. But I wanted to know, just in terms of your experience with the C-suite, not necessarily just yourself, but in counseling those in the C-suite, what expectations and factors prevent the executives out there and other high-level leaders from displaying vulnerability?
Wow.
I'll let Tawani take that one first.
I think a lot of it just starts with societal expectations. I think there's an overarching idea that once you make it to the C-suite, that you don't have the same level of, I would even say, forgiveness or safety to be vulnerable in those places. There's this expectation that you will be Teflon, and I think a lot of times the very humanity of those in those roles is forgotten.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would add to that, I think on some level we've got to understand how commonplace even that idea of it's not okay to be vulnerable is in our society.
Mm.
Just in
Yeah.
day-to-day living, there's already a resistance to showing one's humanity, showing one's vulnerabilities, showing one's quote unquote weaknesses or deficits. And so, as Twani alluded to, the higher you move up in a leadership role, the greater the pressure to be superwoman, to be superman, to have this sort of persona of invincibility, and unfortunately, there's this idea that I really hope as a society we fight and get rid of, and that is to be vulnerable or to show vulnerability will make one appear as though they are incompetent or
Yeah.
weak.
Yeah.
That is not the case. We are human, and so I think those ideas, those underlying dynamics, play a factor in that. The other piece to it is just from a mental health perspective and a relational perspective. To show vulnerability requires a lot of sense of safety. I
Yeah.
need to feel safe with you to show you my underbelly.
Mm.
I talk about I have my four-legged princess, my dog, and one of the things that I learned early on is she'll lay on her back, she'll show her belly as a sign of trust and safety.
Yeah.
Same thing
Mm.
with human beings. We If we don't feel safe, we are not going to show you. We're not going to give you ammunition,
Hmm.
to use against us. And so we've got to battle that, and we've got to help people understand it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay that we're not perfect. Nobody is. But I think even more than that, we've got to make real intentional effort to create safety for leaders to be vulnerable and to
Yeah.
show that side.
Yeah. I think what you both said was very spot on. There are conversations that I had specifically in the last podcast episode where we were talking about um, the person who finally achieves that C-suite level. You're the executive. You may not be the CEO, but you're someone who's making a lot of decisions. You're calling the shots,
Mhm.
and what you do impact the people below you, using quotes for those listening.
Yeah.
Um, there's a part in there that I'd love for you to unpack a little bit in what you just said, where you have to also consider everything it took for them to get there. They're just, I mean, whether it's someone who worked on their doctorate or worked on their master's or whatever it is to get that achievement, or they spent 15 years working their way up from the bottom and now they finally have that little bit of power. It's got to be incredibly hard to you know at least show just a little bit of skin in that armor. What are your thoughts on those things? Presenting pressure for C-suite.
Whew.
I think those things definitely play a role in why
Hmm.
people are concerned about showing any level of vulnerability, because
Mm.
you're like, I made it here and I don't want anything to to disrupt what I've worked so hard for.
Yeah.
Um, but I would have to add, to say that when you are talking about becoming that person who's in essence always on the lookout, you got your head on the swivel for the thing that might knock you off.
Hmm.
That's a level of duress that
Oh.
comes with being in these seats if you allow it to, and
Hmm.
that takes a toll on anyone's well-being when you are always in a heightened sense of alert,
Mhm.
because you've worked so hard, and you are now concerned about staying in that space and maintaining your position. And so it is the epitome and the opposite of vulnerability. It is, I am focused now on maintaining and sustaining where I am.
Mm.
Um, and
Mhm.
that's a lot to take on.
I can feel the anxiety just from the example. It's just like, oh, just it's like Game of Thrones in some manner or respect, where you're always on the lookout. You're trying to perform your best, but you've always got that thing that might be coming up from behind, and it's not a comfortable place.
Absolutely. I'll just say too, in that regard, I think for a lot of C-suite leaders, and maybe I should just own this for myself. For
Mhm.
me, sometimes the biggest threat that my head is on a swivel for is me. It's my internal struggle, my
Mhm.
internal battle. We lately, the term imposter syndrome has been thrown out quite a bit in the last few years, and it is true that that sense of I did work so hard to get here. I feel like I have to work extra hard to stay here,
Mhm.
not necessarily realizing or remembering I'm here because I can and need to be here,
Yeah,
right? I'm
yeah.
supposed to be here. So there's a lot of times looking for external threats to protect against or whatever,
Mhm.
um, really just reflects my internal dialogue that I'm trying to battle to say, no, I am competent. I am supposed to be here. I've earned this seat and I know what I'm doing, right?
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that I have all the answers because we're constantly learning, but I know what I'm doing. I'm not an imposter,
Right.
so I would just add that to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, I would echo what you said there, because that voice in your head that says, you know, I know I felt I was there. I know what it was like to work to get here, but those pressures in your head that say just maybe, maybe I don't deserve to be here, showing vulnerability and having someone else see that maybe there are some weak spaces there,
Mhm.
might be dangerous.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it definitely is a factor and plays a role in why people feel like they have to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you both hinted at it through some of your answers, but I would love to know your thoughts on how company culture contributes to C-suite burnout and trauma, and maybe even grief.
A lot.
Yeah.
You just sum
Yeah.
it up, a lot.
Hmm.
I think the more we begin to learn and talk about, these factors of mental health, we fight the stigma of mental health challenges and actually invest in and really begin to elevate not just the need, but the desire
Yeah.
for employees at all levels, to be well. I think we begin to move the culture in a better direction to support all employees.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I think Tawani and I have stumbled upon this gap in it, which is, but that culture must also reach the C suite,
Yeah.
and so um, everything from having that safe space to take off the armor and say, listen, I got hit today and here's my wound,
Yeah.
right? That matters. And to be able to do that with people you trust, but also, in my instance, I work for a nonprofit. It is vitally important to have a board of directors because those are my bosses. That's who I answer
Right.
to. A board of directors that remembers and understands my humanity and can support me in taking care of myself proactively, but also when I say, hey, I'm not doing okay right now, this is going on, I need to step back for a minute, to actually make space for that and understand we are not widgets and we are not robots. And so, even in the more recent years, when we are talking about the pandemic, we were talking about racial reckoning and the civil unrest that resulted
Hmm.
from that. Eddie, I am a Black woman in the South. There is no way I didn't feel all of the elements, of the last
Right.
4 years. And
Right.
just because of my position in the C-suite, my position of leadership, I couldn't stand on a platform and scream all of these things, right?
Right.
But it doesn't remove the fact that I was impacted too. And
Mm.
so having a culture that remembers or recognizes that, and
Mhm.
also makes space and room for everybody to be human. That doesn't mean that you don't do your job. Obviously, we're here to get a job done.
Mhm.
But understanding that the way I do my job might need to look a little bit different for a little bit so that I can be well and be successful for the company.
Yeah.
Um, I think those kinds of conversations certainly need to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the idea that in when you're in C-suite, you're charged with caring for your staff, those that you are there to serve, and you also are expected, um, to lead them in a certain way. And a lot of times there's the question of, do you have a staff that can hold the tension of seeing your vulnerability and your
Mhm.
humanity and maintain a level of respect for your leadership?
Mhm.
That's the another element that people tend to grapple with when they come into the workspace. I think there are benefits to having staff see those elements of who you are, but then there's also that contemplation of, but are they in a space? Is this culture evolved enough where you have a staff that can hold the tension of respecting the leadership and understanding your vulnerability, as an example, really for them. I have a term that I use with my staff quite frequently, that this is a mistake making environment and that
Mhm.
our best is different
Yeah.
on different days. And so I think that is the essence of vulnerability. At my best today might be, might pale in comparison to my best tomorrow. But how do we create a culture where there's a reciprocal respect of what we all bring to the table? And that building of culture is something that we all grapple with in the
Yeah.
C-suite.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I found one thing very, very interesting, and I know, as you touched on being a black woman in the South, Sabrina,
Mhm.
um, I would venture that there are a lot of similarities to being a black man in the Midwest. Um, with regard to some of my experiences, and the next question I had revolved around honesty and vulnerability in those positions, but I'm curious to know your experience, um, after I kind of allude to mine. For me, there was a huge pressure, and I write about it in my book. Just thinking about the experiences of being the only black person. And I was never the only black person in an organization. That was never the thing. I was the only one in a given department, and we were spread out. Kind of, well, we have our one in marketing, we have our one in accounting, we have our one over here and there and everywhere. But there was a responsibility for me before I got anywhere near the C-suite to try and open doors for those who came behind me, to let them know we're intelligent, to let them know that we are capable, that the degree wasn't just because I could put a ball in a basket. There were all these pressures that came from me, came for me performing well in an organization, which meant that it was very hard for me to be vulnerable, to be honest when I didn't feel comfortable, with the direction we were going, or the inappropriate jokes being said. Like there were pressures for me that changed when I became a part of an executive staff, where I had the power to speak into those things. I was able to be a little more vulnerable, a little more honest, um, and especially being in a majority black space now with one of my organizations, I'm able to have more honest conversations. But just below, it just didn't feel like a reality. I'm curious if that was your experience, or was that was it completely different for you on your way to the C-suite?
Um, well, interesting you asked that question, Eddie.
Yeah.
So I have two different thoughts kind of coming up in my psyche, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being, I don't know that it's a matter of honesty,
Mm.
right? I think it truly comes back to a matter of safety.
Yeah.
I think it is very possible to exist in those spaces, um, for a lack of better words, compartmentalized. That there is the part of you that, we talk about this all the time when we're with people that we are most familiar with, right?
Yeah.
We might present a certain way. When we are not with people that we are most familiar with or feel similar or common to, we might present a different way. But both of those presentations could very much be who you are. So
Yeah.
it's not that you are being dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
It's knowing and being strategic about which part of you shows up at any given time.
Mm.
Um, Now, I say all the time, this is a chess game. Unfortunately, some people think we're playing checkers, but really we're playing chess, right?
Yeah.
And so it's about knowing how to present, who to present in front of, what to say, how to say it. And to some people, that's very exhausting. I get it. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like what you were saying, opening up doors for other people, things like that, sometimes you got to play that game.
Yeah.
I remember sitting with a cohort of mine recently, and we had this huge debate about code switching. And on its face, half of us were like, "You shouldn't have to code switch. We are who we are. Take me as I am." I'm that type of person that's like, because I recognize that we are still evolving as a society,
Mm-hmm.
I will take it upon myself to code switch if it means that I can move the dial forward for the next person behind me to not have to code switch as much as me, and so
Yeah.
on and so on. And I recognize, no, that may not be fair, but that's the life we're in right now. And so
Yeah.
I say I'm okay being somebody who is willing to take that on, to play that
Mm-hmm.
part if it means it can be transformative for somebody else down the road. Um, there are times, to answer your question more directly, I do have similar experiences, not necessarily with being the only Black person in a department. My
Mm-hmm.
organization serves mostly Black and brown children. My staff, is mostly comprised of people of color. However, my board of directors has not reflected that. So
Yeah.
there are times when I go into those spaces and I'm very aware that I am, representing a culture, a people um, that they are not, that's not who they are, right?
Right.
And so I do have to think about how I present, what I say, and that's so multifaceted and multi-layered because I'm also a very passionate person. And so I recognize that my passion can take up a lot of space in the room. So
Yeah.
even for that, I have to figure out how to tone that down, when to, ramp it up,
Mm-hmm.
all with the thought of what am I trying to accomplish? um, and how might this impact the next person who comes along behind me?
Yeah.
That was a long answer, but that's my answer.
It's perfect. It's perfect. It's perfect. Um, did you want to add to that, Tumani?
I have a very a situation that is very much in the converse to Sabrina. I as the CEO for Girl Scouts, I am in an organization that is 112 years old. So
Yeah.
clearly, 112 years ago, someone who looked like me was neither leading or a member of this organization.
Mm-hmm.
And this organization has a very traditional makeup, and the majority of those who lead Girl Scout Council across the country um, don't look like me, and most of my constituency doesn't look like me.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand what you're saying, and will say that there is a an expectation of what this will look like. And so, as Sabrina alluded to, it's not necessarily the need or the attempt to be dishonest, but to figure out what you need to bring to the table for your
Mm-hmm.
constituency, and to move the dial for others to be able to both participate in and have a chance at leading an organization of this nature. So it's the heavy burden of being the first to get through the door and make sure it doesn't close behind you.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you have to be careful that in your attempt to be quote unquote authentic and showing vulnerabilities, that you don't necessarily create a situation that is in opposition to what you're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so it is taxing at times, but you do it knowing that there is a greater purpose
Yeah.
and mission at hand, that you're able to serve the constituency well,
Mm-hmm.
because you know they may not necessarily understand all of the culture that you bring to the table, but how do you come as authentically as possible, being as vulnerable as you can, but keeping before you the mission and the greater good.
Yeah.
Hmm. And I'll just add this one little piece to it as well. As I was sitting here thinking and listening, um, we're talking about race and culture, and how that shows up in the C-suite, and what are the implications of that. But there's also the matter of gender,
Yes.
and so with
Yes.
Tawani and I both being women and women executives, we would be remiss if we didn't bring up that's another layer, of having to navigate choppy waters a lot of times. We know that in our country, at least, there's this, on the one hand, this push for more women to be in leadership positions, whether that's in nonprofit or corporate, or
Mm-hmm.
even congregational leadership. I
Yeah.
recently had an interview with someone who talked about that and the struggles of that. But those are absolutely factors. And something that I'm going to quote Tawani, when she was my boss, something that she said to me that always stays with me, which is, we don't leave our stuff at the door, right? we
No.
can't we can't detach from the fact that we're women, we're black women, whatever it is, that stuff comes with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about trauma and grief in the C-suite, we can't dismiss those factors as well. Those are intersectionalities that
Mm-hmm.
create, if they're not navigated well, or if the culture is not supporting wellness for C-suite leaders, those are intersectionalities that increase that sense of trauma and grief. So we've got to make sure that we don't dismiss those elements either.
Yeah. And I'm glad you spoke on it. I was going to head there, but I'm so glad you jumped into it, because it's there's a big difference there in how, at least the data, I won't say that I've experienced, but what the data says that women have to experience in the workplace versus men, and more specifically what Black women have to experience, as opposed to men. And another topic that I tackled in my book, just looking at the number of Black women who are educated and have excelled in the classroom, but the pay has not reached what they're supposed to receive when you have that. So there's so many layers that, for people who are listening to this podcast, they are into empathy, they are into trying to be allies and friends and supports, and I think it's important that they understand that even when you've reached the pinnacle, you are the head of the bull, or the at the top of the mountain, you're still a Black woman, a Black man, a Latino, LGBTQ, whatever you're dealing with on the outside, that walks through the door with you as well, and that can cause a lot of stress,
Yes.
in a number of ways. And that kind of leads me to another area in which the both of you are experts in, and that is executive coaching. And could you unpack the role that executive coaching plays in addressing this issue and supporting leaders at the top?
Yeah, I think executive coaching is something I think every executive should explore or engage in at some point, because I think a lot of times when you're in these positions, sometimes it's good to get an objective view and someone who can help you navigate some of the nuances of leading people, but also helping you to be a little more self aware
Hmm.
of how you show up, and to lend the ear for all of the things that you do bring into the workspace. I think it's been critical for me, and in my role as a mentor, it's been, I think, helpful for me to share with others the pitfalls of coming in and not being able to show vulnerabilities, and the extreme weight of coming in with cultural biases that are already part of the culture you're walking into. For
Yeah.
instance, I hate these 360 assessments, right? And people love to do them, but it is where you will see people's biases show up the most. I would always
Yes.
get a 360 that was had polar opposites on it, depending on what people's walk in life was. And everybody had these ideas about a black woman leader. So I would get comments like, she's so well put together, always calm and composed. And the next statement would be, she's always calm, composed, and comes off as cold.
Yeah.
So you don't get to be human in that space. You get everybody's cultural biases overlaid over what their perspective is of how you show up. If you're passionate, you as a black woman, you're often the angry black woman.
Yeah.
If you are composed and learn to not react, then you're cold. And so it's a catch-22. Like, how do you show up and how do you navigate that? Because you can't change how people have experienced their world, and you can't dictate how they apply that to their experience with you.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, I'm so glad that you brought that up, Tawani. You know what I'll say is, Tawani definitely lives, at least in my opinion, lives in that space of executive coaching. I typically just tell people I live in the space of mental health therapy. So
Hmm.
to me, I think an executive coach is that neutral, objective third party to help you problem solve and develop skills to be able to get the job done in the best way possible. I think where I come alongside people is really to deal with that internal stuff, and to sift through and process those things that may be impacting how you show up, right? So,
Hmm.
for example, I've already mentioned imposter syndrome. I've already mentioned, just for me, my passion. I've gotten to a point now where I tell people my passion is my superpower, but I also understand through my executive coaching, that it can also be my Achilles heel. And so, where my work with a therapist, because I have a coach, an executive coach, and I have a therapist, and I see them faithfully. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
um, my therapist helps me unpack, and learn to really embrace my superpower of passion, um, even when external factors might want me to shrink it,
Yeah.
or pull back, right? Whereas my executive coach says, okay, this is your superpower. Let's figure out the best ways to leverage it and the situations to leverage it to get to the end result that you need.
Yeah.
So I encourage people, I encourage all people, get you a therapist too. But definitely for C-suite leaders, I echo Tawani. I highly recommend um, finding an executive coach, and not just any executive coach. I think you need to find uh, a coach and a therapist who have cultural competency and
Yes.
who have the ability
Yes.
to have awareness and check their biases so that they can
Mhm.
provide the highest level of support for you.
Yeah. And I think that part is critical. The finding the right therapist. And I learned personally that takes time. It's not searching through Google and looking at the ratings and, 50 people really like, Sabrina, so I'm going with her. It's you've got to sit through a few sessions and do your due diligence to see if it's a good fit before you can really move on. But yeah, I agree, and wish I had taken that route earlier in my career. But I'm so grateful that I have it now in my career.
Yeah,
Um,
and if I could just throw one thing out there
yeah.
to kind of give an example of what I mean by the difference between, for me at least, therapy and executive coaching.
Hmm.
Again, using the example of my passion as my superpower,
Hmm.
there are times when my passion enters into a space, something happens. I take it to my therapist and say, "This is what happened, and this is how I feel.
Yeah.
This is what this is saying to me," um, and she will help me process and unpack that. When I take that same story to my executive coach, and this is a true story. One day she said, "Now you know that was petty, right?" So so
That's great.
so the
Great.
therapist is with empathy is like, let's dig, let's unpack that, let's understand, what was really happening at the core for you. Whereas
Hmm.
my executive coach says, listen, you are an executive, you have a responsibility.
Hmm.
I understand that your feelings were hurt, but your reaction was petty, right? And so I
Hmm.
think for me at least, I need both of those voices.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a balance in between
Hmm.
those two for sure. This is the end of part one of my conversation with Tawani and Sabrina. Tune in next week for part two as we cover the trauma and grief in the C-suite. The Unbroken Place podcast is presented by Elevate One Consulting. The show is produced by Say Something Studios. Learn more about both of these in the show notes. The show's music is performed by Little Glass Men and Captive Portal. We want to thank you for being a part of the Unbroken Place community. Look for an ongoing conversation on Instagram and Facebook at the handle @UnbrokenPlace. You can also find some helpful resources at eddiepaulthomas.com. Make sure to sign up for our newsletter called OK on Second Thought on LinkedIn. Until next time, one love.
In a world where thriving teams, engaged managers, and ethical leaders are the backbone of successful business, how do entrepreneurs set the stage for human flourishing while scaling up? The answer is ongoing effort, leadership, and intentional communication. At Elevate One Consulting, Dr. Erica Garcia Thomas and Eddie Paul Thomas are helping to turn the tide. With a blend of evidence-based practices, interactive teaching, and dynamic public speaking, they're not just consultants, but revolutionaries in improving company health, growth results, and employee engagement. Specializing in revitalizing brands, coaching leaders, and accelerating projects, Elevate One Consulting offers a comprehensive suite of business services designed to enhance team leadership and customer experience. Whether advising executives, guiding digital marketing strategies, or transforming organizational culture, they're here to elevate your business to the next level. Don't settle for a business that survives. Ensure that it thrives. Visit www.elevateoneconsulting.com. ELEVATE consulting.com today and take the first step towards creating an environment where everyone flourishes. Elevate One Consulting. Innovate, grow, elevate.
Say Something Studios.